Chapter 6. Life with a capital L. Late July 2001, Costa Mesa, California. The summer had scorched the park grass, trampling it to death. Empty beer bottles glinted in the dust around the benches like forgotten mementos that no one bothered to clear away. Cayde was talking. Too much. Too pointlessly. He laughed at his own jokes before the others could even react. His movements were wide, overly restless, and erratic. He'd bolt up from the bench, pace 2 useless steps, then sink back down. He couldn't stand the silence. "So then I told him, mate, if you know the score so bloody well, then go ahead and organize my life too." He grinned, already diving into the next story with a mechanical momentum. Nova was smiling, but her eyes didn't move. She just watched him, motionless. Vexley kicked pebbles under the concrete with the toe of his shoe, listening in deep silence. For a while, Roxy laughed along with him. Then she stopped. She just stared at the boy, and the smile slowly drained from her face, inch by inch. She saw the desperation in his eyes, a kind of vibration she had never seen before. A breeze stirred through the treetops, but it brought no relief. No one said a word, but they all felt it. Something was very, very wrong. The house party was already at its peak. The living room air had grown heavy with smoke and the sickly sweet scent of cheap booze. The music wasn't a melody anymore, just a pulsing thrum, like a tired, overworked heartbeat. Cayde sat perched on the back of the sofa, turned halfway toward Roxy. He idly swung the bottle in his hand. He didn't move closer. He didn't have to. It was enough for him to open his mouth and let out that deep, raspy English accent he reserved only for her. "Careful, love, because we both know exactly what happens inside you every bloody time I speak. And you know that no matter how hard you try, there's not a damn thing you can do about it." Roxy turned toward him very slowly, as if processing the boundary he had just visibly crossed. A line the old Cayde would never have touched. Her gaze swept over him, lingering for a second on his eyes before dropping lower to the pulsing vein in his neck. Then, in a single predatory motion, she snatched his wrist. She jerked him toward her. Cayde's shoulder buckled forward, booze slopping from the bottle, but Roxy didn't let go. She yanked his face so close to hers that the room's noise dissolved into a dull, distant roar. Time simply stopped in that tiny vacuum of space. Not a single muscle twitched in Roxy's face, her eyes narrowing into dark, tense slits. Her gaze raked across Cayde's features before anchoring on his mouth. But there was no softness in it, only a raw, ruthless hunger. Roxy's fingers tightened around Cayde's wrist until her knuckles turned white, while her other hand instinctively balled into a fist against his chest, as if weighing exactly where to strike first. Her voice was barely more than a choked breath, grazing the corner of Cayde's mouth. "You are so fucking dead." Nova sat on the kitchen counter, one leg swinging lazily in the air. The hum of the refrigerator filled the narrow space with a dull, stifling weight. On the counter, tiny droplets of condensation rolled down the sides of abandoned glasses like slow-motion tears. The bass from the living room filtered through the walls, the throb of a distant, alien world on the other side. Vexley leaned against the fridge, holding a half-empty plastic cup. He didn't drink from it. He just swirled it, watching the remaining ice cubes clink together with a hollow, empty sound. Do you think we could actually do it? I mean, a band? Nova asked. It didn't sound like a big question. It sounded like something she'd been chewing on for days and had finally spat out into the silence. Vexley didn't answer right away. He looked around the kitchen as if taking inventory of everything that was about to fall apart around them. School was over, and being carefree had gone out of style. The future had suddenly become too concrete and too gray. Morning shifts at the warehouse, dusty aisles, and stacked boxes where a person grows old, quietly and unnoticed. At least Nova's vintage shop was colorful, filled with weirdly cut clothes and music that didn't have to be played quietly. And Roxy, she was spending the summer in her father's office, surrounded by files and coffee stains, as if she were temporarily trying on the costume of another foreign life. If we do it together, then yeah, Vexley said finally, his voice unusually deep. I think we'd be a damn good band. Nova smiled, but there was no cheer in it. It was the look of someone who was daring to believe, for the first time, that this wasn't just a game to kill time before everyone went their separate ways. On the other side of the wall, someone laughed loudly. The music flared up for a second, then sank back into the background. The next day, they sat in Roxy's garage. Dusty sunlight slid across the concrete through the half-open door, stretching the shadows thin. Cables snaked across the floor in tangled lines, like someone had drawn a lost map to their future. After half an hour of quiet, aimless strumming, Cayde put down his pick. He looked around at the team calculating, the way a person weighs just how big an avalanche they're about to trigger with their first honest word. The neon light hummed dully, tiredly from the ceiling. A thin layer of dust rested on the drumskins, and the guitar amp waited with a low, impatient hiss for someone to finally make it speak. Nova sat cross-legged on the concrete, her fingers moving mechanically over the strings. Roxy spun her drumsticks between her fingers, and Vexley stared intensely at the cables, as if hoping for answers from their mess. Finally, Cayde took a deep breath, like someone coming up for air after a long time underwater. My parents, they want me to go to university. The sentence hit the concrete hard, without an echo. He didn't joke it away this time. He didn't wrap it in sass. They say it's the only normal way. That the band is just a summer, just a phase. He gripped the neck of his guitar, his fingers tightening until the knuckles turned white against the lacquered wood. And the trouble is, they're partly right. I don't want to be rotting in a warehouse when I'm 30. I don't want to look back 10 years from now and say, fuck, Cayde, why weren't you smarter? Silence. The hum of the neon became almost unbearable. But when I'm here, he continued softly, almost to himself, when we're together, I feel like if I let this go now, I'll never be fully me again. Something will be lost for good. Roxy's hand stopped. Nova looked up slowly, her gaze stifled. Vexley's face was motionless, but understanding flickered in his eyes. Cayde swallowed the last of his pride. So yeah, I'm leaning toward it. Leaning toward going. But I really don't want to lose this. The garage, our lives, you guys. The garage sank back into silence. But it wasn't the silence of waiting anymore. A bitter tension, tasting of a final decision, seeped into the walls, making every breath feel heavier. A few days later, in the early evening, Vexley was at home when his father called out from the living room. "The girl with the red hair is on the phone for you." Vexley took the receiver. "Get to Roxy's. Band meeting," Nova said, and the line went dead. A dull, yellowish light sat heavy on the dust in the garage. Sunlight filtering through the half-open door cut diagonally across the concrete like a sharp boundary line that no one wanted to cross. The air was stagnant. Only the low hum of the neon tube and the dry, nervous click of the snare drum broke the silence. Cayde sat on a chair, leaning deep forward, his guitar propped against his thigh. He wasn't playing. He just stared at the ground, as if trying to find the answer to the thing he hadn't been able to escape for weeks. Roxy sat behind the drums, spinning her sticks mechanically. Vexley crouched by the wall, fiddling with an oxidized jack plug something that should have been thrown away long ago. But right now, it was the only thing he had to hold on to. Nova stopped in the doorway. She didn't speak at first. "I talked to the principal," she said finally. The sentence was simple, yet it hit them like a grenade. Roxy's hand froze midair. Vexley slowly raised his head. Cayde straightened up, as if he suddenly needed more oxygen. Nova stepped inside, her shoes scuffing quietly on the concrete. "I found out you can defer university for a year. It's not automatic. You have to request it. You need a recommendation from Mr. Thomas and a formal application. But it works. You're just in time." The silence in the garage grew even thicker, not from uncertainty, but from the sheer weight of someone actually doing something instead of just talking. Vexley scanned the girl in disbelief. You hate every authority figure on this planet. You won't even look toward the principal's office, let alone knock on the door." A half-smile lurked in his words. Roxy let out a quiet laugh under her breath. Nova shrugged. "Yeah, I made an exception today." Cayde just watched her. The usual coolness was gone, along with the overplayed confidence. Only raw, honest confusion showed on his face. It was as if he didn't know what to do with the fact that someone had taken his downward spiral so seriously. Nova didn't walk over to him, but her gaze stayed locked on his. No drama, just a quiet ultimatum. "It's your move now." Cayde finally nodded. Not to the others, just to her. Nova stepped toward the workbench. She pulled a worn, crumpled envelope from her pocket and dropped it onto the dusty surface. The paper landed with a dull thud, far too loud for such a small movement. "I sold a few records," Nova said, her voice completely devoid of emotion. "It's enough to get Roxy's drums fixed, buy a decent amp, and stop us from trying to save the world with 5-year-old strings." Vexley walked over to the table. He pried the envelope open with 2 fingers. The edges of the banknotes were uneven, as if they'd been stuffed in far too quickly. The boy's face slowly went rigid. Every unnecessary expression froze and vanished. "You sold the Milo!" He looked up, stunned. Nova didn't answer immediately. She just held his gaze, then confirmed it with a barely perceptible nod. The air in the garage stopped moving. Roxy lowered her drumsticks into her lap. "You wouldn't even let us touch that record, Nova. You said it was your life." "I don't need it anymore," Nova said, cutting her off. "Right now, we need something else." Vexley still stood over the envelope. How many times had he seen that record in Nova's room, kept apart from the others like a sacred relic? Cayde stood up too, but he didn't move closer. He just watched them, and for the first time, it looked like he was starting to understand. This story wasn't just about them anymore. It was about the weight of the responsibility they were taking for one another. Vexley slowly closed the envelope. His movement was careful, almost respectful. The envelope lay there on the dusty table, and they all knew. From that moment on, they could no longer pretend this was just a summer game. This was for real now. A few days later, the light was already burning behind the living room window. The yellowish glow sharply outlined the figures moving inside, while outside, the evening slowly began to cool. Cayde's father stood in the center of the room. At first, his movements were angular and firm. His hand rose into the air time and again, as if every gesture were bracing the weight of his truth. He paced. He stopped. He started again. Cayde sat at first, leaning forward, elbows on his knees, gaze fixed downward. Then, slowly, he straightened his back. He stood up. The movement wasn't sudden, it was stubborn. From that moment on, he didn't look smaller anymore. They stood facing each other like that for a long time. The rhythm of the argument shifted. His father's gestures grew muted, his steps less frequent. Finally, he stopped and just looked at his son. The mother stepped closer. For a moment, she touched Cayde's arm. The boy turned toward her, then slowly walked to the window. When the light hit his face, the expression was no longer the same as it had been at the start. In place of the tension sat a quiet, hard-to-read calm. Behind him in the room, his father finally sat down. When they stood in the garage again, the guitar was already slung over Cayde's shoulder. He didn't grip it desperately. He just let it rest there, as if feeling its true weight for the first time. "I got 1 year," he said. "After that, I have to go." The sentence didn't crash down on them like the bad news before. Instead, it hung in the air like something they had already factored in. Silence followed, but it wasn't tense now. It felt spacious. Nova nodded slowly, as if she'd already mapped out that time in her head. Vexley slapped Cayde on the back with a half smile. "A year is a hell of a long time if we don't waste it." Roxy sat behind the drums and gave the snare a soft tap. The sound felt lighter now than it had at any point in the last few days. "Then let's spend this year making something that can't just be left behind," she said. From somewhere outside, laughter filtered in. A car radio, the sound of distant lives. The sun slowly dipped behind the houses, painting the dusty walls of the garage in shades of gold. Nothing was solved. The future still stood before them, as uncertain as ever. But for the first time, it didn't feel like the enemy. They had 1 year, and suddenly, that didn't sound like so little.